Hello and welcome to the LinkedIn Blue Talk series. I'm privileged today to have here at IE University campus in Madrid, Dame Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, who was actually president for two consecutive mandates, the first elected female president in the continent. I guess you have a fascinating story. I read actually your memoirs for preparing this interview, which were called This Child Will Be Great. You share so many different anecdotes, so many insights, and in fact it's a very good story of recent Liberia. So this is my first recommendation today. But let me share with the viewers also some other aspects of your biography. You were trained both in Liberia, but also in the US. And then you mixed a career in business along with career in administration. You were Minister of Finance between 1971 and 74. You worked for the World Bank, also taking responsibility for the Caribbean and Latin America. You were arrested a number of times for telling what you thought about transformations in your country. You were exiled, and then you became the president after the two civil wars in Liberia, first in 2005 and then 2011. You were actually given, also awarded with the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011, in recognition for your efforts to bring women into the peacekeeping process. So it's a fascinating story, Madame. If you allow me to call you Ellen, but what I suggest is that people get inspiration from the many anecdotes that you share in your memoirs. Allow me to ask a first question that has to do with your philosophy of leadership. What I many times say to my students here at IE University is that management is philosophy in action, that behind any major decision, either in management or in politics, there's always a vision of the world, a vision of the good life, there's principles and values. So I wonder, what has been your philosophy of management, your philosophy of leadership over this long career that you had?
First of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
As you correctly said, I did my high school work in Liberia. I did my first undergraduate work at the Madison Business College in Wisconsin, which enabled me to get knowledge about financing and financial transactions, prepared me for a business career, so to speak. And then I went to the Economics Institute at the University of Colorado in Boulder as for preparation for the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. My philosophy, I guess, if I were to use three words: listen, learn, lead. And if I try to apply those three words, listen meaning you don't know it all. You improve yourself from the experiences of others, the knowledge of others, an interaction with others that enables you to understand their values, their principle. And by listening to them, you learn from them. And that learning expands your own capacity to deal. And with that, you put in a position where you can lead. You can do what a leader is supposed to do, is to take charge, is to guide the effort toward the achievement of certain goals, to lead the decision-making process in such a way that you do lead it, but you lead it so that you have others who not only accept that leadership, but promote that leadership, and forming a team toward that. So that's how I capture it, of what I was able to do in a very difficult environment, having become president after a 2 decades of civil war that was preceded by a coup d'etat that destroyed all of the early progress that our country had made. And so,
indeed, I mean, it's very challenging times, and we are talking about challenging leadership. But what you say reminds me of something that my students tell me when I ask them, you know, on the very first day of the course on strategy, I ask them, what should leaders nurture as their major virtue? And they say, listening. Now, apparently there are many leaders today who are not listening that much, or not learning, you know, at the pace that we need, and applying that into their own style of leadership. But allow me to ask you something that also has to do with how you have taken lessons from mistakes or from situations, challenging situations in the past. I recall that in your memoirs, you write that when you were a baby, an old man approached your house and saw you, and he predicted, this child is going to be great. Is going to be a great person. So to some extent you were predestined not to become a leader. But what I'm sure is that serendipity is something that you actually work, that you search, that opportunities you seize them. No, they are not coming just as a coincidence or just as moral luck. And I was wondering how you learn from the different challenges and maybe mistakes sometimes, since we can also learn from failures, not just from successes.
going back to the statement by this old man, let me say that I was a baby, that he was just visiting in those early days of my birth. And when he said this, I don't think my mother really took it seriously. Her reaction was, well, this is just good wishes, you know, from an old man. She's not born into any royal family where she will be great or anything like that. And as we progressed and had our share of hardships in life, certainly we would all, in a way, laugh and say, what happened to that old man's statement? Why am I not great? But obviously, the journey to success is a long road. And so why in those early days we joked, I think the evolution of my journey, as tumultuous as it was at so many times, it still ended with a certain level of progress, a certain level of achievement along the way, achievement that provided the self-confidence to be able to know that if you kept moving the goalpost, expanding the areas in which you can have achievement, and you brought to it a certain amount of commitment to achieve it, recognizing that you would face obstacles along the way, but be prepared to have the strong stamina to stay the course and go past the obstacles. I always told my friends that, and my followers and my partisans, that failure was a necessary part of success.
Indeed.
See it as, you know, the upside down of success, because failure enables you to see where your challenges have not been fully addressed, where your opportunities have not been fully recognized and taken. And so you use that to improve yourself, but you cannot do it alone also. I think that is a fundamental part of good leadership. You don't know it all. And you need to reach back.
And rely on others.
Rely on others, learn from others, and show that you gave them the encouragement to follow you, because you lead by example also. You can't depend on just saying what you do, but be able to act what you say you can do, and also to be realistic. There are times when what the obstacle you face may be simply beyond your ability to achieve them in the time frame you want. So the ability to see moving ahead and success as a dynamic process where revisions and changes and adjustments are also necessary. I think having that kind of philosophy enable us to make major changes and revisions in the manner in which we approach Ebola. And
Indeed.
with being
That was a
able
big
to
challenge.
move, from a military approach to a community leadership driven approach, brought a big difference in the effectiveness of our response. And so
You talk about realism, which is a very important facet of leadership, which has to do also, and I recall some passages in your memoirs also. For example, when you were attending the opening, your first opening ceremony as president, and you say that you felt the burden of the position, and that you felt the need of being humble. So this humbleness, is also a very distinctive feature of true leadership. So many leaders actually think on those occasions that they deserve that credit, but you reveal that at that time you felt, the burden of the position, the responsibility to become a transformative leader, which is, in my opinion, something very revealing. You probably have memories of that first day and your speech and your vision for the country.
yes, I do. It was my very first meeting to participate in the African Union Authority. And as I entered the hall room, the meeting was in Sudan. And when we got there, the women, either those who were ministers participating in the meeting or other women who were part of the official groupings, headed by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Africa, Nakosama Zuma. She led that group, and as I entered and left my vehicle, they all started to sing, and they all started to clap and to wave and whatnot. And so that was quite a joyful occasion. That showed a whole lot of appreciation from the part of those women, representing the women of Africa, as they said. And so I went in, just as you correctly said, with a feeling of responsibility, with a feeling of knowing that, I represented their aspirations. But at the same time, I also relied upon the values of my family, because my mother experienced things in which the family condition changed from one of prosperity to one of near poverty. And so there's one thing she always taught me and my siblings. Three things were honesty, hard work, humility. And those particular values have stayed with me in life. And so even as I entered the hall that day to the applause and joy of women, I knew that I was coming into a place of men who had known domination all their lives, who was going to see this as the first intruder in their midst.
Which happens quite often, not just in politics, but also on corporate boards still. I mean,
Exactly.
We have to conquer, gender balance, which is still, a challenge for many of our societies. Can I ask you about speaking out? Because you have been a person who didn't actually, you weren't silent, and you actually denounced many, many things. And my question has to do with the duty of speaking out, standing up when we see injustices in our society. We have recently, for example, seen in the US a few years ago, CEOs of leading companies for the first time speaking out after Black Lives Matter. I mean, which is is good because what I guess is that CEOs and managers should stand up for the values. Companies in the end are organizations that have an impact in society. So traditionally they only responded to their shareholders, but today they have a responsibility also in front of many different stakeholders. But what do you think about speaking out and about talking, as you have done, in the past, of course, at the risk of being imprisoned, and you were imprisoned or being exiled. So you didn't actually have fear. You probably had fear, but anyway, you did it your way, and you didn't actually doubt when it was to do with telling the truth.
Well, I think in my high school days, I was among the small group that always took a position, always had something to say. And I think that ability to go past any self-constraints about standing out and speaking up is something that stayed with me, because I think just by doing so, yes, it brings you a lot of attention too. It can bring you a lot of problems too, but that in itself enhances your ability of self-confidence, that you can speak out and
that's a good advice.
Sometimes you can make a difference. Sometimes you can change things. And so I always carried that ability to speak my mind, to take a position, and that enabled me always to stand out, to be recognized as someone who's not going to just be there and listen and learn, as important as that is, but use listening and learning, as a means to express yourself, to try to make sure you change things and challenge things and move things in a direction. And so I pay the price many times for this, because there are times too when you learn to speak out forcibly and freely, that you might challenge those areas that get you into serious trouble, where you offend the powers that be, and you pay the penalty for it. In my case, my penalty is 1 or 2 times to go to prison because of that.
Indeed.
But that in itself is a learning experience. Going to prison, you learn that you never knew what others had suffered by being in prison, and that gave you a stronger sense of realization of the realities of the world and what needs to be done to address the inequities and injustices. And that gave you more strength to speak out again against injustices, because you had experienced it yourself, and you can speak on behalf of those who are marginalized, those who do not have the voice to speak. And so that got me into trouble again several times. but I think by this
Indeed.
time, I think people were just accustomed to it, and I continue to do so today, perhaps with a little bit more caution.
Like Benjamin Franklin, who is in his memoirs, Benjamin Franklin explained that at some stage in his career, he decided not to criticize others because he realized it didn't actually produce the effects ever, no? No, but it's a very good piece of advice for young students, to stand up, speak up and stand out, and exercise their critical thinking skills, no? Which are essential for them in order to develop their personalities. Can I ask you also about resilience? Because all these experiences, of course, have forged your resilience in order to face lots of challenges. And even if it's not comparable what we are living today with your experiences, being in prison is not comparable, of course, with being confined during a pandemic. No? But we are actually, and young generations are facing lots of challenges today in Africa, but also in Europe. And I'm thinking about ongoing wars, the invasion in Ukraine. So my question to you, in order to convey some advice to young students, to young people, would be how can they build up this resilience that make them stronger in order to face challenges and hard situations?
If I use my personal example, I would say that my resilience perhaps was rooted in faith, because my mother was a preacher. And so
Right.
I could always rely on the fact that my mother's prayers, you know. I mean, that's a personal means of resilience. Obviously, not many people may share that. But I think for those, like in our countries, who have experienced certain things, and sometimes your experience may be of a personal nature, whether as a student in a place where you find yourself excluded because of your heritage or your religion or your race, and that enables you to know that you will not allow yourself to be demolished. You will not allow yourself, you will not want for others to define you, so to speak. And that brings that self-courage to be able to exist in a situation when you face these kinds of exclusions, to be able to accept it for what it is, but to rise above it, and to still maintain your dignity and your personal thing. And resilience, I think, in our country, given all the tumultuous experiences that we have in the coup d'etat, in the civil wars, we came out of it with the feeling we cannot allow ourselves to be totally demolished. We have the capacity to rise again. We have the capacity to win. And that resilience, when it's expressed by leaders, when it's demonstrated through example, it tends to become a convincing element for societies, and encouragement and hope, because hope is also a major part. If you lose hope in everything, then of course you settle into a situation of despair, and that takes away from the self-confidence, to initiate the effort that takes you above your obstacles. But generally, human nature have the capacity to rise above it. We see it over and over, all over the world, and it is because of that self-surviving instinct that we have.
Nurturing hope is very important.
Absolutely.
No? And avoiding despair. And I'm sure that your words are very inspirational for many people who are suffering these days: invasions, oppression, war, discrimination in many other places. And talking about discrimination and embracing diversity, we are proud at IE University because one of the values that we cherish and that we implement across many different activities is the embracement of diversity, not just respect towards diversity, but embracing diversity, not just in terms of gender, but also visions of the world, visions of the good life, sexual orientation, personal preferences, no? And this embracement of diversity is certainly a source of learning for all, because sameness doesn't actually teach you anything. If you just join others who think like you, who behave like you won't ever learn anything, no? But I was wondering, what's your vision about diversity? I recall in your memoirs you say that at the time of your first election, many people in your country were looking forward having a woman as a president because past male presidents did not very well. And women are generally, although, using cliches is always, criticism, but anyway, women are normally, more prone to negotiate and to implement peace and to do things and to be hands-on. So what's your vision about diversity and how we can actually implement diversity across all the different layers of our society?
My own commitment to diversity has its roots in the origins of my country. Liberia was founded on freed slaves from the United States that came in to coexist or to be integrated into indigenous populations.
Indeed.
But they came in as strangers who did not understand the culture and tradition of the population. And so there were wars, there were disputes, there were conflict among them. And so there was exclusion on the part of those who came and created the republic. And that chasm that existed between the two sides lasted for so many years, and we're not effectively addressing integration as much as sought through education, through our extended family system, still was not achieved until perhaps education of the population across the divide, the coup d'etat that brought in, much more integration, but that in itself, and because our country also have religious diversity, it was important in these latter years to ensure that we see each other for what they are, because we have 16 different ethnic tribes in our country, each one with slightly different methods of language, dialects.
That's amazing.
But they learned to coexist with those differences. And so the challenge, the ability, the desire to coexist. And so diversity in itself brings the strengths of others, the cultures of others, which are also an enriching experience. And if we look at the experience of the United States, and why did it take a George Floyd for people to see the discrimination and the exclusion and the marginalization that existed? Incomprehensible in a nation that was educated, had prosperity, and still practiced exclusion at that level because of the color of the skin. And so that process, I think, is ongoing. I think George Floyd, they're waking the consciousness and the sensitivities of those who had perhaps knew it, didn't practice it, but didn't do anything about it. Silence is also a killer. Because if enough people remain silent to a very obvious wrong and do nothing, then it's just as much as giving the order, from those who are the real perpetrators.
Indeed.
So we believe right now in diversity there's strength. In diversity there's a full integration. It's an enriching experience.
Absolutely. I would also like to ask you about how we could foster the empowerment of women, indeed, across all different bodies and institutions. And allow me to share with you a sort of epiphany that I had 5 years ago, because we have pushed, of course, gender balance across many different boards and the faculty at IE and the student body. But then I was teaching my course on strategy on the very first day, and I was very proud because I had changed the whole curriculum. And then one student who was British, male and white, he stood and said, well, all the companies here are led by CEOs who are male and Western. And then he was completely right. I went to the Harvard Business Publishing Library, which is the source, of most of the case studies in business. And I discovered that night that there were only 11% of the case studies where there are women at the top as CEOs, and most of them actually related to glass ceiling cases. No, there was just one in the area of strategy. So the point that my epiphany had to do with the role that educational institutions can implement in terms of not just telling how the world is, but how the world should be. I mean, we need to develop a sort of prescriptive research, showing the best cases and inspiring young women who may become future CEOs. But I wonder what you think about other measures that we can implement in order to enhance gender balance and, of course, the empowerment of women in society.
Well, I think you touched on an area that is currently my most area of concern, promoting the participation, the empowerment, the leadership of women. It's just simply unacceptable that today you mentioned 11% among CEOs. One democratically elected president in Africa, which completed the term, and now it's back to zero. In many of the bigger nations, you've never had women president. In Europe, there have been, like in Scandinavia and other countries, you know.
Because they implemented
because
reverse
their laws
discrimination and affirmative
put
action.
in place all the approaches. And so today in Parliament, 24% women, with a 50% population of the world. Why? Because over the years, the stereotyping of women are sort of the weaker gender. Women should be the ones that take care of the home and the children. Yes, that's our role, that's our function, we do it well.
Well, you combined, both things excellently, I have to say, but probably you have to share many lessons, from your own experience there, how to reconcile family duties, growing up your children. You have 4 children and already grandchildren as well. But also you had a very demanding professional life.
It's true. And more women are rising above the stereotyping, the systemic barriers that they have faced, not because they lack the competence or the knowledge or the courage, but simply because systems have excluded them. The laws have not granted the equity they deserve. Constitutions have not enabled the laws to make sure that equity persisted. Patriarchy, in which in groups men feel they are the dominant one, therefore they should be the one that make decisions.
Indeed.
That's the challenge we have today.
Well, you have our full support. I have one last question.
But let me say something.
Sure.
For institutions like your own, it's not just the learning from the case studies, it's the doing. We want to see, do you have equal women professors?
Absolutely. And we do have, fortunately, we have a 50-50, balance
good
at our
you.
full-time faculty, And it's not a coincidence, as you can imagine. I mean, it's the result of being, very active in. But allow me to ask you a final question that has to do with the many lessons that Africa can actually teach the Western world and other countries. Because when I read your memoirs, or we learn from stories of other countries, of course, a leading reference like Nelson Mandela and many other stories, what I realize is that we have to learn a lot from Africa in order to see how we can solve conflicts, how to integrate our societies, how to become much more inclusive. So what would be your recommendations in order that we learn more about the many good things that are happening in Africa?
You say you have a Center of African Studies.
We do, indeed. And
so
of course, we're invited to come.
The examples, like you pointed to, the example of Nelson Mandela, some who really stood for, compromises, courage, everything you can think of that a leader ought to have, is something that he exemplified. Indeed. So being able to use his example and examples of others on the continent who served as role models. I hope you'll have more African students in the university, and more than African students, students from Latin America that bring in a
Indeed.
different culture.
And African descendants also. You know that in Latin America there's a good population, large population.
I hope you would have a relationship with an African university where you can have exchanges of professors and students. That's how you foster the type of learning and the type of diversity and the type of enhancing culture and whatnot. So for what you've done here, you talk that you do have a 50% or anyway a high level of parity. I commend you for that, and hope that you do. I'm going to meet your students.
You are indeed.
Very soon. I will see the diversity among them.
I'm sure you're going to enjoy. You're an excellent speaker, very inspirational. So again, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, thanks so much for being in this conference series, the Blue Talks of LinkedIn. And you still have a lot to teach us. So what I hope is that we can count on your inspiration for many more occasions. Thanks very much for being an iconic, inspirational leader. Thank you.
Thank you.